summer evening for the last of our bee series. Some of you have been to, has anybody been to all 4 of them?
Joan diehard. All right.
That's awesome.
Tim raises his hand. Tomorrow.
So we are lucky enough to have Candace tonight. For those of you that don't know Candace Casados, she is part owner of Mason County Bee Supplies.
I'm Alden's store manager.
Okay, well,
Yes.
you make things happen, as we know. Whenever we need something, you're texting her immediately. But she also is extremely important in the Scottville Beekeepers Association. Our meetings would not run as efficiently. She just makes things happen. So you've been busy this week. She was just over at the Children's Museum.
That's right. Lenny and I were there on, I don't know what day it was.
Yesterday or 2 days ago.
Yeah, it was a few days ago.
And they're going to be doing Bee Day with the library later, later this month.
We are.
Children. So we're really lucky to have Candace here. She's been all over. Colorado and California and Hawaii. So we're really lucky to have her here as a local beekeeper. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm really excited for tonight's presentation to learn about bees throughout culture and history. So welcome, Candace.
Awesome. Glad to see you all here. Thank you for sharing your time with me and with each other on this beautiful day. A word of forewarning: as I was tweaking my presentation yesterday evening, I decided to take it in an entirely new direction. Why? Because I like to do things like that. So I will be reading a lot of printed notes because what I memorized was now out the window for the most part. So please bear with me, but I've tried to include some decent visuals. So as beekeepers and people that are even interested in bees, I think a lot of us know that they've been around for a long time. And it really wasn't until I started, doing some research into this presentation that it really got a much deeper understanding of how prevalent they've been throughout the entirety of human history. So it's it was really interesting and fun for me to do this research and to share it with you. And let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, I can't get it to work again. My clicker. I know that I clicked on, you're just gonna have to show me where to click. Sorry, guys. I need a lesson on where to click.
I think just click in there.
Okay, I was afraid of closing something or moving something.
There we go.
It worked. Okay, so here it is. Over the 70 million species of insect on our planet, there's one in particular that's been revered and held to be sacred throughout history, cultures, and the world. And it's the humble bee. The humble bee. So archaeological evidence has shown that since ancient times, from almost every corner of the world, bees have played an important role in human life. They've influenced our physical well-being, commerce, creation myth, sacred stories and places, and are viewed even today as a symbol of reverence and community. But why? What makes bees so special? Now that's a loaded question if you've got a beekeeper in the room, because I'm sure that we can spend at least a few hours telling you how bees have impacted our lives and why we feel that they're special. But there's a few things, a handful of things in general that bees provide to the world and to us humans that we benefit from that other insects, they just can't compete with. I'm just, this is not a biased thing. It's just, they're the clear winners. So some of the things that bees provide that add value to the world and to human life are obviously honey, which is nourishing. It adds sweetness to our lives. There is wax, and wax can be used in many, many different ways. Obviously, in the form of candles, which has been used throughout the ages. It could be used in cosmetics and for various different utilitarian purposes. Propolis, which is a product that the bees make that is incredibly healing. And we're talking about like magic level healing. And it's something that the bees create as a health product for themselves within their own colonies that we humans can utilize. They provide pollination, as we know, to many of the plants that we eat and enjoy, and to help keep us healthy. They actually provide this acupuncture. And it's something that Lenny, our own Lenny from the Scottville Beekeepers Club, is, he's not here today, I'm pointing to his wife, Joan, sorry. Lenny by default. And it's something that Lenny actually practices, and that is using bees, the stinging of bees as a form of acupuncture. Which is incredible for healing things like inflammation in different areas of pain in your body. Bees have also served as role models throughout time and history. If we look at, and many people have looked at the honeybee in particular for the way that they organize their own democracy, if you will, the way that they organize and self-govern so beautifully, so seamlessly, so peacefully. The bees also provide a sense of mystery. There are things that these bees do that science has mostly explained, but we can never really, I think, wrap our minds around. And I think that's part of the beauty, is that we will never, ever be able to dissect and pinpoint exactly what makes bees do what they do. And so for those reasons, bees have been with us throughout our lives. And so here is a small, quick glimpse of bees throughout ancient times. So if we start over at the Cretaceous period, the oldest known species of bee lived 100 million years ago. And I've got a picture of her right there. 100 million years ago, this bee was fossilized in amber. And she was found in a mine in northern Myanmar. 100 million years ago. We're talking dinosaur times. There were bees on the planet, which is absolutely amazing. Well, if we scoot up our timeline a bit, if we're over into the 1300 BC, well, there are indications that Stone Age people harvested bee products, and we called them honey hunters. Now, right here, what you're seeing, this is a honey hunting is interpreted here from this 8,000-year-old rock art. And this rock art was found in the Arana cave paintings in Valencia, Spain. These cave drawings depict honey hunters risking their lives to climb a rope ladder to harvest bee products from a nest of wild bees high off the ground. And as crazy as it sounds, this is actually still practiced today in some parts of the world. To add another layer of fun and element of intrigue and danger to that, oftentimes the honey hunters that are still harvesting honey this way are harvesting what they call mad honey. And it is honey that is produced from the nectar of flowers that have hallucinogenic properties. So you will find these honey hunters going up, risking their lives to gather this amazing honey, bringing it back down, and then celebrating their harvest with some, what I would imagine would be some pretty wild and hopefully some insightful some nights. So honey hunting actually still continues to this day. Now, if we move way forward up the timeline, up in during the 5th dynasty in Egypt, beekeepers were depicted blowing smoke into hives as they removed honeycombs. And then honey that they were able to extract would be stored in earthenware jars. So as you can see here in this picture, this is a 26th dynasty hieroglyph depicting a beekeeper with their hive of bees. And it's something that always really fascinates me is, how did these people figure that out? How did these people figure out, first of all, that this little insect was, could create this, and how do they rehome them? It really is fascinating to me. And so I absolutely love this depiction here. You can see there are hives right there in the looking like a little stack, and the bees flying around them. And to think that there were actual beekeepers in the time of the Egyptians is pretty amazing. So the practice of domesticated beekeeping actually developed in ancient Egypt around 2500 BC. The first recorded human management of beehives appears about 5,000 years ago. The hives used by the Egyptian were horizontal hives, and they were made of dried mud and straw, which were stacked upon each other to create walled apiaries. So known elsewhere in the ancient world as the land of the bee, Egypt exported huge quantities of honey from the south of the country in big clay jars, as well as large volumes of beeswax for cosmetics. So, and I don't know if anybody is very familiar with Egyptian culture, but Egyptians used of makeup. They often wore wigs and would use the wax to seal the hairs of their wigs. And it is rumored that Cleopatra took baths of honey and milk to maintain her glorious queenly skin. I've never tried it. I think I should. I think we all should. Let me know how it goes. Where am I here? Oh, sorry about that. And this is something that is always really fun to share with people. When Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, research found earthenware jars that had crystallized honey in it. That honey was dated to be 3,500 years old, and it was still viable, meaning you can still eat that honey. Like, how amazing is that? Here is an insect that creates a product out of nectar that it has gathered, and it is able to withstand the test of time. There was no formal sealing of things. They didn't have the capability that we do to keep things airtight, but the honey itself, in its amazing antimicrobial, antiviral properties, was able to maintain its integrity for 3,500 years. That to me is absolutely incredible. So there are documents indicating that almost 14,000 tons of honey were transported along the Nile. The production and exporting of honey and other products was tightly controlled by the state. And they were amazingly fun titles given to the workers that oversaw the operations. And some of these names were Sealer of the Honey, the Divine Sealer, Overseer of all beekeepers, and Chief Beekeeper. I think I'm going to start calling Ed Mikowski Chief Beekeeper now. But they took their honey exportation very seriously. This was a really big product for them. So the commerce that they were able to do because of the bees was huge for the Egyptians. We're going to backtrack a little. So moving over to about 800 BC, the Greeks used tree hollows, clay pots, and eventually beehives to keep bees. Now, around the same time, in Tel Rahav, in the Jordan Valley of northern Israel, archaeologists found the largest honey production facility or production of beehives that ever occurred in ancient times, which was pretty amazing. Look at how they created these out of unfired clay cylinders. So over in Israel, they were keeping, and we're talking like mass amounts of these beehives. I think of it as like our little hobby beekeepers. Maybe we have, 5 hives. Maybe we have 10 hives. Maybe we're really big stuff and we've got 30 or 40. And that's now in modern times with all of the modern luxuries and the equipment, and I'm going to call them amenities of beekeeping. Well, back then, they didn't have any of that. So it's pretty incredible that they had such a large scale production. in such a huge apiary. So it is believed that Greek beekeeping practices were brought to Greece from ancient Egypt, and hives dating back to 3400 BC have actually been discovered in Greece. So honey also played a major part in Grecian life. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, wrote, "Honey and pollen cause warmth, clean sores and ulcers. They soften hard ulcers of the lips. They heal carbuncles." Don't ask me what a carbuncle is. And running sores. He had various mixtures to treat different conditions, and they all used honey. And that is true to this day. There are so many natural remedies that contain honey that we still use to this day. In fact, I can't remember in which state it was, but there is intensive burn units. Honey is actually applied to some of the most extreme burn cases because it helps to protect the viable, healthy skin cells. It helps to keep out bacteria from the wounds and helps to regenerate your skin cells. So how amazing is that all these ancient years ago, people knew this. How did they know this? And that again blows my mind. How did Hippocrates know to use this on wounds and internally to help the sick? It really is incredible. So he had various mixtures to treat different conditions, all using honey. He had a formulation of honey and vinegar for pain. He had mixtures of honey and various other substances to cure fevers. And Hippocrates had also written about mixing honey with components such as sodium carbonate and other ingredients for treating ulcers. And I bet you all of that stuff would still work today. As evidenced in the writings of Aristotle and in Varro and in Pliny the Elder, bees were used in order to predict the rain as well as and the weather, and were even named weather prophets. And if you are a beekeeper or you know a beekeeper, you will understand, and that will make sense to you, because what do we beekeepers do all the time, especially when we know we're going to go check our hives? We check the weather. We see what the bees are doing. What are their flight patterns like? What are they doing as a group? What is their energy like today? And if you are observant and can take note of the patterns, you will absolutely find correlations between the behavior of your honeybees and the weather and the impending weather. You can usually tell when there's a storm coming if you watch bees closely, which is pretty cool. Where are we at here? Oops, sorry. So although no hives or illustrations are known for ancient Rome, oh wait, are we there yet? Yes, for ancient Rome, horizontal hives dating back to 250 BC have been found in Iberia when that region was part of the Roman Republic. Unfortunately, several books include accounts of beekeeping that illuminate the practices of the day. Some built round hives out of wicker for the bees to stay in, and others used wood and bark. Others used the hollows of a tree, and some keepers even used earthenware. But making them, oh, here we go. I'm so sorry. And others built out of earthenware, and still others fashioned them out of fennel stalks, building them square. And it was amazing because they had these dimensions that were 3 feet long and 1 feet deep, and making them narrower when there weren't enough bees to fill them so that they did not lose heat in the large empty spaces. So that's something that we beekeepers take into consideration now, is the size of the boxes, because we keep them in boxes now. The size of the boxes or the containers that we keep our bees in makes a difference to your colony. And so the beekeepers of Greece and Rome knew that too. And they were able to accommodate that depending on the colony size. So some of the Roman hives are thought to have been made from cork and oak bark and wicker. And this led to the creation of the straw skep, which is a beekeeping method that was used for centuries thereafter. They also made underground beehives in clay at the bottom of trees or dug into rocks on the mountainside. And this way the bees would be protective, and they would let the bees live for a full year until they wanted to collect the honey. Now, when people started keeping bees in skeps, what they would do to harvest the honey is they would actually crush the skeps, because the skeps were made of like woven materials and plant materials. They would crush the skeps, and the honey would essentially, it was the real crush method. They would crush the outer walls of the skeps, crushing the foundation inside, and essentially killing any bees that were in there. And apparently this could be done depending on what the weather was like, and what how well their colony was doing inside the skep. This could be done several times throughout the year. But with this method, when they had built these hives at the bottom of trees and into the ground, they would let the bees live for a full year before they had to, basically destroy the colony to harvest that honey. We're gonna back up here a minute. Here we go. Oh, sorry. I don't need to back up yet. I need to go here. So we're gonna skip back to the oldest large production facility for producing honey was identified to date back to the Iron Age in the Jordan Valley of northern Israel. And at this site, which is a large facility of unfired clay cylinders, contains the remains. They actually found the remains of bees in this clay. The apiary included an estimated 100 to 200 hives. That's a lot. That's a lot. As a beekeeper to this day, it's a lot. How many beehives do you have? 2. Ingrid, how many hives do you and Tim have?
2.
2. Okay, I have 4. And it's a lot. It's a lot of work. Again, with our modern amenities, it's still a lot of work and effort. But for these people in ancient times to have up to 200 hives of this manner is pretty remarkable. This discovery provides a tangible link to the Old Testament phrase, to the promised land flowing with milk and honey, which is cited in Exodus 3:17. So we're going to move on to the Middle Ages. So down over, we're going to go to the end of our ancient timeline here to 500 to 1000 CE. And we'll talk about beekeeping in the Middle Ages. So forest beekeeping flourished in the Middle Ages in Europe's woodlands, especially what is present-day Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Germany. Honey and wax were major trade commodities at the start of the Middle Ages, and forest beekeeping evolved from honey hunting for wild nests in tree cavities. There you go, we've got honey hunters again. The honey hunters began enlarging the tree cavities to facilitate the growth of the wild bee colonies that they found. So here they are. These people in the Middle Ages realized that the bees were naturally finding and creating their homes in the trees, and then they would manipulate them. They would manipulate that space, make it larger so that the colony would grow and stay. The honey hunters began enlarging the tree cavities to facilitate the growth, and this eventually led to carving artificial cavities into trees in the hopes of attracting a colony. Modern beekeepers call that creating a swarm trap. Because when we provide an artificial space for the bees to live, scout bees, as their colony grows and they need to split and find a new home, scout bees will look for a new piece of ideal real estate. And so we as beekeepers in modern times, and obviously back in the medieval ages, did the same thing. We said, hey bees, I'm gonna create a space for you. I really hope that you come here. So throughout Northern and Western Europe, beekeepers began to use the skep as a beehive, and Northern architecture began to embrace the honeybee as it became popular to place skeps in what is known as bowls. A bowl hole was a cavity or a recess in a wall where people would place their skeps. This was especially helpful in the medieval times when there were battles going on. So at some point during the Middle Ages, the skeps were commonly used as weapons. This form of defense was used in the latter half of the Middle Ages, and it's documented by a 1326 English manuscripts that includes an illustration of skep hives being thrown over castle walls at invaders coming towards them. Can you even imagine? Can you even imagine? You know, there's enemies approaching, and what do? You start throwing live bee colonies at them. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever been chased by bees. And show of hands, anybody? Has anybody? Yes, I have. I don't know if anybody's ever been chased by bees, but it is it's slightly terrifying. It is slightly terrifying. So what an ingenious way I mean, I'm sorry for the bees, but it really is, it was an ingenious way to use something natural as a form of self-defense. Where am I at here? So there's very little written information about the practices of beekeeping during the Middle Ages, but more details have been discovered from illuminated manuscripts, which were transcribed books that were produced by monks who copied books on commission for nobility and wealthy patrons. But what about beekeeping in other parts of the world? So the majority of work on apicultural history is Eurocentric in nature, but beekeeping happens all over the world at the same times. There are Chinese references to bees and honey that date back, and they were used for medicinal purposes that date back to 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And the oldest Chinese pictographs for honey were bees carved on bone, and that dates back to 1,000 BC. The Chinese word for honey, which is mi, was written in 300 BC. The first details of ancient Chinese beekeeping date back to the 3rd century and described how the interior and exterior surfaces of wooden containers, which is what we use now, with a small entrance hole, was completely rubbed with beeswax. And during the swarming season, 2 or 3 bees were captured and placed in that box and then released. And then, with any luck, more bees would come. Again, it's another example of humans creating swarm traps. And in this case, the Chinese actually kind of stole bees that would be out in the wild. And maybe they'd get lucky and they would be scout bees out looking for new real estate. And they would, in this case, forcibly put them in the container to show them how good it is, and then release them and hope that the rest of the swarm would find their way there, which is pretty cool. The Maya enjoyed a beekeeping tradition by the time the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century. They used honey as a trade with the Aztecs, and discoveries of cached beehives dating back to the Maya late pre-classic period, which was between 300 BC and 250 CE, offer the oldest evidence of beekeeping in Mesoamerica. An important record of Maya beekeeping is the Madrid Codex, which was created around 1400. And the last 10 pages of the codex include details of Mayan beekeeping, including images of log hives, both the interior, exterior, the harvesting of honey, and the deities associated with beekeeping. So little is known on the origins of beekeeping in places like Korea and Japan, but the records are sparse and kind of contradictory. So it is known that beekeeping was practiced in Korea as early as the 1st century CE, but little detail is provided to determine whether honey hunting was part of their beekeeping. Honey hunting was definitely being practiced in Korea by about 300 CE, and true beekeeping by the middle of the 7th century. So beekeepers in Vietnam were housing bees in baskets and box hives by the 8th century. And there was, there were beekeeping happening in Angkor Wat in Cambodia, dating back to 1000 CE. That shows bees being collected in logs, boxes, and pottery hives as well. It appears and it also appears that beekeeping developed independently in India. Honey likely was robbed from the giant honeybee. So in different parts of the world, there were different types, different species of bees that people were either gathering honey from or keeping, trying to domesticate. The relatively late development in beekeeping throughout Asia, it's likely related to the presence that they had other natural sweeteners. And so getting honey wasn't of the utmost importance to them. I'm going to skip through a little. So these are some pictures over here that we are going to explore a little bit. So that was a lot of information about beekeeping in very practical ways in ancient times. And obviously it's a lot of that has carried over. We use the honey, the wax in very similar ways. We still use it for commerce. We use it for cooking, for sweetening. A lot of that hasn't changed. But a lot of what has changed and a lot of what was created back then that carries over in different ways is the mythology and the myth behind these, and the myth and the lore of beekeeping. So for the Egyptians, the sun god Ra, I don't think he's pictured here. I don't think I pictured him. The sun god Ra cried tears that became bees and then created honey in the world. The Egyptian god Apis took the form of a sacred bull, and the Latin name for our modern day honeybee is Apis mellifera. King Mims, who's right here pictured in his big stony face, was referred to as the beekeeper, and his domain in Lower Egypt was known as the place of the bee. The great mother goddess Neth was worshipped at Sais, and her temple is called the house of the bee. So there's some amazing bee lore to be found in Roman and Greek mythology. So before Dionysus was torn to pieces and returned as a bee, he was in the form of a bull, and his worshippers, called Maenads, were often depicted as frenzied, dancing, winged females. So like Zeus, the god Dionysus was raised in a cave, and he was fed on honey. And today he is viewed as the god of wine, but the worship came earlier than wine, and from a time when mead was the major alcoholic beverage. So even after wine took the place of mead, honey remained sacred to Dionysus, and his followers had ivy-wrapped wands from which the honey flowed. And I don't know if you can see it well in that picture, but he's got, he's not holding the wand. He's holding ivy around. He does have ivy around his wrist. So the Greek poet Hesiod, who is active around 750 to 650 BC, wrote of the Muses that whomever they honored and looked upon at his birth, on his tongue they shed a honeydew, and from his lips would drop gentle words, and he would speak counsel unerringly. The most important ocular sign of ancient Greece, which is Delphi, was said to have been constructed by bees. The oracle of the temple itself was an object called Omophilus, a carved dome shaped like a beehive and covered with bee-like images linked in a beautiful pattern. So we would be amiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the Druids, because the Druids, who were Celtic people, had a really special connection with bees. They, and very much like some of the other, it carries over into other parts of mythology and other cultures, believed that bees were the link to the other world. They believed that when you fell asleep, that when you went into a trance of any kind, and at death, your soul or your spirit essentially was transmuted into a bee. So I have a very interesting, so bees were seen as messengers between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And it may have been because back then when people were hunting these wild bees, oftentimes these wild bees would make their homes in the crevices and cracks of rock walls. And it was believed then that behind those walls were like accesses to the other world. I have a very a very personal story, which I hope my child doesn't mind me sharing. But several years ago, my family and I were in Arizona, and my oldest child, Griffin, had to leave a most beloved horse here while we were out of state. So the horse was injured, and the horse, that beautiful, wonderful horse, his name was Whip, he ended up needing to be put down because he was very injured and he was very old. I learned of this information one morning or one evening, and the next evening we went on a hike through the desert. It was winter time in the desert, and I don't know if you've ever been to Arizona in the winter time, but it is a scene of just incredible vibrancy. The colors, the blooms, the smells are just absolutely stunning. So we're on this incredible hike, and we're hiking up to this to the small rock mountain formation is the goal. And all along the way, I keep seeing bees. And I hadn't seen hardly any bees in Arizona since we had been there, and we'd been there for a few weeks. Well, all of a sudden I keep seeing bees, and I feel like they're following us on our hike. And as we get closer and closer to this rock formation, there's just more of them, and there's more of them. So finally we make it to the top. And this entire time I'm just racking my brain, and my heart is breaking, and I'm thinking, how do I tell this to my child? How do I tell this to my child? Because it's going to break my child's heart. So we reach the destination, and there's this huge rock formation there. And that's when I see it. There's bees, a colony of bees that lives in somewhere in that rock formation. And they're coming through this crack, just visibly. It was the first time that I had ever seen a wild colony in my life. And there they were, of all places. And my oldest child, Griffin, says, "Mom, the bees are found you." And I said, "No, they're not here for me today. They're here for you because they have a message to tell you." And at that point, I did have to share the sad news. And it instantly, and Griffin knew, I believe Griffin knew that lore of the bees, that they were believed to be messengers, spirit messengers to the other world. And nothing solidified it more to me than that day. I really feel that there was some connection there. So the bees had a very strong connection, especially in the Druid community. And these bees were held in very, very high reverence. Thanks for letting me share that story, Griffin. I really appreciate it. So there's this wonderful saying, and it said, "Ask the wild bees what the Druids knew." The Druids were extremely connected, and are extremely connected to nature and to the spirit of every living being. There's also another way to look at it, which I love, and it is, ask the Druids what the wild bees knew. So what did the Druids know? Well, they know that bees have long been considered divine messengers for the gods, and until quite recently in the highlands and inlands, people thought that when in sleep, trance, or death, the soul left the body in the form of a bee, a belief that has clear Druidic origins. Druids were trained in the art of soul flight, by which they could journey to other worlds for knowledge from the spirits. They would probably have endorsed the tenet beloved of the mystery schools of the Near East, which is si sapis, sis apis. If you would be wise, be a bee. Bees were so central to the mythology and culture for the ancient Irish that the old Druidic laws, the Brehon laws, were said to be protected as a tradition by the bees themselves. The Brehon laws contain 20 pages entitled Bee Judgment that spelled out specific regulations regarding the care and ownership of hives, bees, and swarms. We don't even have a state inspector anymore. And these people had 20 pages of laws governing how people should care for their bees. So in other parts of the world, and in Lithuania, it's perhaps the most pristine source of ancient and modern bee worship. As beekeeping has existed as a revered way of life there for as long as can be remembered. Because the lore of ancient Lithuania has an oral tradition and the country remained relatively primitive by Western standards, its written records of these amazing histories are minimal. Lithuania is also known to have the longest living path of pagan worship called Remuva, as one of the last Western countries to experience the spread and acceptance of Christianity. Its folk traditions remained uniquely intact and were never completely wiped out. Justra is their bee goddess, and it's also one of the most popular names given to the Lithuanian girls today. So in this bar picture in the right here, you can see some hive structures at the Lithuanian beekeeping museums. I am looking forward to one day traveling and visiting this museum. Maybe one day I will strive to create a bee museum here in the United States. Anybody wanting to collaborate that on the future, you let me know. Maybe we won't have to go all the way to Lithuania. So the Mayan culture is one of the only ancient cultures known to have worshiped bees in the primarily masculine form. So in all these other forms of bee worship and in bee reverence, you always see it's the goddess, it's the goddess, it's the goddess, and naturally so and rightfully so. In a colony of bees, there is one queen. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of female worker bees, and there are very, very few male drones in a colony. So it makes sense that the bees were were worshipped for their feminine qualities. Even though they were primarily celebrated and worshipped in the masculine form, they did refer to the bees as our ladies. Their bee god was called Ahmuzen Kab, and his temple was in Tulum. Ahmuzen Kab is associated with world creation in Mayan mythology, and it's believed that honey, in some kind of psychoactive form, again, there's that honey with other, psychoactive qualities to it, was used in worships. And shaman from the Mayan tradition still use a form of humming based on the sounds of bees in their trance-inducing and their healing chants today. So the lore of bees and death is especially spoken of in Wales. If there's a death in the family, it was important that someone in the family told the bees before the funeral. This was known as the telling of the bees. So bees were thought, especially in the island of Wales, were thought to be like extension of the family, members of the family. And I don't know if anybody had observed the news piece that when Queen Elizabeth died recently, their resident beekeeper went out to tell the bees that their master had passed and tied a piece of black cloth, or I'm sure if it was cloth or ribbon, onto each hive as a sign of mourning. So this telling of the bees was really important to people. They would tell the bees of births, of deaths, of any changes in the family. They were really treated as members of the family in that way, and making sure that important information was communicated. Now, in Wales, they had some interesting beliefs. They believed that if a swarm entered your house, it was unlucky and it foretold of death. But other Welsh folklore contradicts this and says that it was actually lucky for a swarm or bees to come into your house, but it was bad luck if they left. So I think they got you coming or going either way there. We are at here. So coming into more modern times, and looking at bees here in the United States. By the 1700s, the colonists had set up over 170,000 hives, primarily used because the honeybees were valuable themselves. They rivaled the price of sheep and hogs. Beekeeping was so profitable that in the newly formed United States, the Congressional Congress actually donned a bee skep, if you can see it right up there in that picture, as part of their currency. Now, by the late 1800s, Mr. Langstroth, the father of American beekeeping, he started to tinker around and he finally nailed his modification of another beekeeper's design. And he made what is now known as a Langstroth hive, which was a completely movable frame. And that is what most of us modern beekeepers use today. Boxes, 10 frames in a hive, move them around, manipulate them as needed and wanted. And it really did, I think it really did revolutionize the ease of beekeeping. Unfortunately, in 2006, colony collapse disorder was well underway. And in 2006, people really started to take notice. People really started realizing, hey, we have a problem here. And if we don't do something about it, we might not be able to come back from this. Collapse disorder is something that we are still experiencing. We as beekeeper go through great pains to ensure the health of our bees, but there are variables that are inevitably beyond our control. Variables like pesticides used on GMO crops, electromagnetic frequencies, the deforestations, the wiping out of natural native plants and habitats as our communities grow and as commerce grows. So this is a very, very real issue that we are still facing. Please rest assured that the beekeepers in your area are doing everything that we can to ensure the health and the longevity of our bees and to carry on this incredibly important gift of beekeeping that our ancient ancestors were able to experience. And that's something that I really fell in love with, was that there's so much that we don't do in our lives that our ancestors experienced. It's like we really do live completely different lives sometimes with our modern amenities, with the way that we communicate. But we keep bees. We keep bees. The Grecians kept bees. People from all over the world have kept bees. The Egyptians kept bees. And here we are still continuing on that practice today. We are still learning. We are still carrying on these beautiful traditions and sharing the gifts from the hive with one another. And hopefully, as beekeepers and as people who appreciate bees, we can continue to help them in the future to thrive and to be able to bring joy and health and a little bit of mystery into the lives of generations to come. So if you are not a beekeeper and you are interested in some different ways to help bees, here's a few really easy suggestions. Number one, leave an area of your garden or your property, just let it be wild. Let the natural native plants that are growing there, let them grow. Don't mow them down. Don't put weed killer on them. And maybe try and shift your perspective away from, well, that's a weed. No, that might be a flowering plant that a pollinator could really find as a valuable resource. So leave a little patch to flourish. Now in Scotland, the practice of doing that was actually called the Goodman's Croft, the plot of land reserved for creatures of the wild, which also included fairies, or what they called as the good folk. So leave a little patch for your bee fairies to thrive on. You can create a wildflower garden. You can sprinkle native wildflower seeds on your property. I mean, I don't know how many of us have unused parts of our property that, you know, aren't being utilized. Some of us utilize almost every inch of our property in the best ways, but I know a lot of us, including myself, have a lot of vacant land that I could be putting to better use by simply spreading out some native seeds and providing some valuable resources to our pollinators. You can support small beekeepers by buying their local honey. Is anybody selling honey here? Ingrid, are you selling your honey yet? Or are you just gifting it?
I'm just now jarring our first round, and I've been encouraged by my husband to actually start selling. So
Yes.
this will be the first year for that.
Awesome. And I hope that you do. I know that Lenny and Joan also, you know, they sell their honey from their hives. Supporting your local beekeepers is so important. It really does help us to continue our practice and our love of beekeeping and helping the bees. I can tell you right now, beekeeping is not the cheapest of hobbies sometimes. And so it's not like we're making, you know, tons of profit off this, but it really does help to keep us going. And it's really encouraging to be able to see the need from the community, the desire from the community, and be able to connect with one another and provide a resource that is just so healthy and so very special. You can also buy organic vegetables. Even better, you can buy local organic vegetables. I know that we have a lot of fantastic farmers right here in Mason County that sell their organic local produce right here at our farmers markets here in downtown Ludington. Does anybody want to remind us what day that takes place? Fridays, excellent. So maybe this week, instead of taking your shop to the big grocery store, maybe take a wonderful meander through the farmers market. Joan, were you going to say something?
Taste of honey.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So every year the how many years has it been now? 5?
With the exception of the 2 between.
Oh, okay. With the exception of the COVID years, our group, the Scottville Beekeepers of Mason County, holds an annual taste, the Sweet Taste of Mason County. It is a free local honey tasting event that we put on for the community, and beekeepers from all over from Mason County come with their honey and their bee products to share and provide samples. And so members of the community can come through. They can taste honey from all over, from different areas of Mason County, and connect with their local beekeepers and just have a really hands-on experience of tasting all of these different honeys. And if you think you taste one honey, you taste them all, you are wrong. You are wrong. They are amazing. In fact, I just sampled some of Ingrid's honey that she had gifted to Griffin today. And it was fantastic. And it tastes completely different than my honey. It tastes completely different from the Moyer's honey. It tastes different from Alden's honey. And we're looking at beekeepers that, you know, aren't hundreds of miles apart. We're tens of miles apart, and yet what our bees bring in, what they're the nectar that they're creating their honey from, all just makes it so incredibly unique. So the Taste of Honey happens every October, and Joan here does a phenomenal job of spreading that information with the community and having that event always just be an amazing success. So we're looking forward to you help to spreading that word again, Joni. So that concludes my presentation. I'd just like to leave you with this wonderful quote that I found that I thought was so appropriate for the library. Books are the bees which carry the quickening pollen from one mind to another. And that was by James Russell Lowell. So I'd like to thank the library, and in particular, thank you so very much, Ingrid, for all of your work, all of your efforts, and for being the brainchild of putting on this series, this summer series about bees, all the wonderful presenters that you brought on, and for you for providing another opportunity for the community to come together, to learn, to share, and just to be together. So thank you very much, Ingrid, and
Well,
thank you for the library.
And thank you to Robin for that being the head of our adult services to make
Yes.
this happen.
Thank you,
and,
Robin.
To Thomas and Chris for doing all the video for all 4 series.
Thank you.
But Candace, I couldn't stop thinking, the Lorax, in the Lorax, he says, I'm the Lorax and I speak for the trees. And I
Yeah.
think we need to get you a shirt that says, I'm Candace and I speak for the trees. Because you just give me goose, like, wow, that was just really wonderful and educational and all the work that you put into it. It's incredible. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you, especially those who came to all 4. We appreciate that greatly. And Candace, just a huge. There are snacks back there, there's pop and, well, there's water back there. And then we do have packets of seeds, of wildflower